go ahead and introduce yourself.
Okay. Hi, I'm Danielle Troetti, and I'm a teacher at Bethel Middle School in Bethel, Connecticut, and I taught an 8th grade English language arts class.
Okay, good. All right, so first questions. We want to understand the decision you made in planning for this lesson and how it fits into the unit and year. How does this lesson connect to and build on students' prior skills and knowledge?
This lesson connects to and builds on students' prior knowledge in a few different ways. In one aspect, it's the first piece of literature that they're reading within the new unit. And this unit's the 3rd unit of the year, and the focus is on looking at how authors' perspective and message and purpose affect the way they understand, or a reader understands, history. So in one way, it was our introduction to that concept. In another way, the students have been working throughout the course of the school year, obviously, on developing their understanding of complex text and how to understand what they read and view and hear, and to really make sense of that. And so they've been doing well with their annotations through formative assessments and other things that they've done, but they were kind of seeing annotations as an end in and of themselves. And so I needed to take them to the next level where, one, they knew that their annotations were just a starting place to help them make meaning from text, but they should really be using them to question text for themselves. And we're also working on using questions so that they can initiate conversation, academic discourse on their own. And so the questions they were asking tended to be very literal, and even if they were text specific, they weren't deeper questions that were going somewhere. So the purpose of this lesson was to try to get them to the next place where they can more independently lead their literature discussions.
Okay, great. Still on that question, what was taught before this lesson and what will come after it? Discuss the sequence of lessons that surround this one lesson.
The end of the previous unit also dealt with perspective and analyzing perspective and theme and word connotations and things like that. So there was a natural progression from that unit into the beginning of this unit. As we only started the unit a few days ago, and as part of that, the students read, annotated, discussed, started to ask some preliminary questions about the text, which was the focus of today's lesson, which is I Hear America Singing by Walt Whitman. Coming up, they will be reading I Too by Langston Hughes. Again, as far as skill, looking at annotations in determining the meaning of independent words and phrases, looking at the message as a whole, asking questions about and making inferences about author's purpose and perspective and how all of that really impacts the piece as a whole. And eventually they'll be using both Whitman and Langston Hughes, comparing their views and their messages to talk about how both deal with the concept or the American ideal of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and how the portrayals in each affect the reader's understanding of that American ideal. And then this is actually the modeling part of the unit. From there, students will be continuing to do this with different pieces of literature or multimedia around particular events or concepts from American history, eventually leading them to a point where they'll be able to choose an event of interest based on some research, pull together different perspectives, writings, videos, things of that nature around a topic, and then actually explore the unit's essential question: how does an author's presentation of information affect one's understanding of history? They'll be able to answer that with their own research and based on their own topic.
Is the text used in this lesson part of a sequence of text designed to build skills and knowledge? If so, please give an example of other texts that form this sequence.
Yes, and I think I may have alluded to that in the previous question a little bit, in that the annotations, the questioning, the determining author's message, purpose, perspective, looking at multiple texts addressing the same topic or concept or possibly event, or even if they're around a figure in history, that students are really developing those synthesis, those analysis skills with a reading focus the annotation, the questioning, but there's also a large group work component in that. And even though the students didn't do much writing today, where we're using the academic discourse to practice, but they will also be using what they're practicing in speech to then actually start to compose some informational pieces and some arguments about the topics they're reading.
Talk about the standards targeted in this lesson. What did you do to make the lesson reflect the full intent of the standard?
There were a few standards that I was considering, and then I realized I really needed to kind of focus on a couple. So one would be, it was an 8th grade class, so the reading literature 8th grade standard number 4, which looks at very specific words and their connotations and their meanings and their effect on the message or the piece as a whole. And then also this, obviously the first standard, because text evidence is always a piece of what we're looking at, and they were very much one of the criteria for the questions that they need to learn to ask themselves are that they need to be text dependent or text specific, and I tried to convey to them that you can certainly use those text specific questions to then broaden your conversation to a larger topic or idea, but you do need to keep it grounded in the text and then come back to the text even if you're making connections outside the text, which I hope that they do. And then the other piece, I just lost my train of thought.
You want me to pause for a minute?
Yes. So they're addressing standard 1 as far as their text dependency and their support of what they're talking about with evidence from the text. And really, they can't separate that from standard 2 either, because a huge part of the higher order nature of their questions is connected to the author's main message or theme. So those are the reading standards that I was really gunning for in this lesson, and then speaking and listening standard 1A, and eventually 1C as part of the sequence, today's lesson, tomorrow's lesson, and the lesson after that, really all have to do with how they prepare for discourse, use the questions during discourse, and then use that discourse in their questioning to come to a deeper understanding. So that's how I connected the reading and the speaking and listening standards.
Which of the core action indicators do you think this lesson best exemplifies, and why? Core action 1, I really considered what texts would meet both the complexity level as far as the literary elements that would be present for the students to analyze, and there would be enough there for them to create really deep, rich questions from that. So that was one of my considerations in choosing the Whitman text. Conceptually, it also is obviously really connected to Langston Hughes's I Too Sing America. And so the fact that those two pieces work together in my using today's lesson was the first part of my gradual release model, to be able to start there and then release to them with a very conceptually related, the second poem actually alludes to the first. It was just a very natural choice as far as text complexity and appropriateness. Langston Hughes, I Too, is actually cited in the CCSS Appendix B as an exemplar text for grades 6 through 8, and Walt Whitman's "Oh Captain, My Captain," I think, is also cited there. So even though that particular poem isn't, the poet is. So I think that those reflect core action 1, but the activity also very much focused on text dependency as far as the types of questions that they're having, and using questioning as a way to really dig deep into the concepts and ideas presented in a text, and to question a text and sort of have a conversation with the author in some ways. So I would say that it applies to both core actions 1 and 2 most appropriately. We're interested in how the shifts required by the CCSS are being incorporated into your instruction. Discuss how this lesson illustrates the shifts required by the CCSS.
I think as far as complex text and academic language, the literary devices present in this poem and the poem that will be following it in the instructional sequence, they address the academic language as the students really need to look at the actual definition or denotation of words. They need to address the connotation, the figurative as well as the literal, and they need to look for patterns within that academic language and within the literary devices that the poets use. So I think that in that way, part of that shift is met. It also deals with, as far as for 8th graders, issues of an American ideal and how those American ideals are met by different sections of our society at different points in history. I think that that in and of itself is something complex for them to wrap their minds around, as evidenced by some of their comments trying to place Walt Whitman with Martin Luther King and the women's suffrage movement and trying to make sense of that in their group discussions, which was interesting. So I think that that is somewhat complex for them. I also think that the...
Hold your thought.
Yep. We didn't...
1 sec.
Sure.
And you are on.
As far as the shift to text dependency, again, so much of the lesson focuses on creating knowledge specifically from the text and using reading strategies to better access the text, and then have a discussion about the concepts presented through the text. Text dependency is just it's one third of the criteria that I gave them as far as their questioning and what they should be doing within their reading strategy. And then the nonfiction piece was not. It was somewhat present in the lesson in that the students conducted a little bit of inquiry in the class just prior to this lesson to get a better understanding of where Walt Whitman and his views fall in history so that they can understand his perspective. It is a piece of poetry, so it is a literary piece of text, but we will be addressing nonfiction throughout the unit as a whole. As a matter of fact, the whole focus of the unit really is around how different perspectives or the way things are presented affect our understanding of American history. So certainly informational text will be represented in the unit as a whole, and they need some understanding of history to interpret the literature that they have.
How did you teach the content of this lesson or this text prior to the CCSS? What is the same and what is different?
I don't know that too much has changed. I think I'm much more aware of giving students language like text-specific and text-dependent because I'm so aware of it as a teacher. I think before I would just say things like, you have to support it with the text, you're not allowed to just say that, you need to prove it. So I think that it has changed maybe the language that I use to discuss it with students.
What's the same and what's different?
Can we pause for a second?
Sure. Okay, so we're rolling. How did you support all students in working with grade level text? For example, how did you provide scaffolding for students below grade level so they can read at grade level text?
There were a few actions that I took in relation to that for this lesson. One was that when I originally gave the students access to the poem, there are a few students in the room with special needs who had the poem provided to them ahead of time. We had read the poem together prior to it being introduced to the whole class, and they were provided a video clip to a reading of it on YouTube that also had supporting images to help support the vocabulary and the fluency aspect of reading the poem. Within the class, I strategically grouped students so that they were in groups that were fairly heterogeneous, but there were natural supports based on personalities and understanding within the groups. I also had question stems prepared for students in groups if they were struggling with the questions that they were given, so that the questions were broken down. As it turned out, the two groups in particular that I thought might need the breakdowns did not. They were able to answer their questions on their own. They demonstrated understanding when I went around to the groups, but I had those ready in case they needed them. On the other hand, I also had some question stems prepared for students who typically don't struggle, and so I had questions to connect conveniently they're studying very similar content in American history right now. They're on the American Constitution, which is built on some of the same ideals, obviously premises as what we're talking about with Whitman's poem. And so I had some questions prepared for those students to ask them to try to maybe make some connections between the content in both classes. And I have a similar construct set up for this series of lessons coming next, where students are more independent in creating their questions and leading their own discussions based on the next poem, based on what we've been talking about. And so I also have question stems for students who may be struggling, who need some assistance crafting their own questions, and then some areas of focus to challenge some other students.
How do you know that students were able to successfully respond to the text-dependent questions, tasks with precision? Did students acquire the literary skills addressed in the lesson?
There were a number of formative assessments that I had in place. There was a little bit of back and forth as a whole class, but that was really more to just touch base. When I went around to each group, I was specifically looking to see that the annotations and the notes on people's pages demonstrated understanding of both the criteria I was looking for in questioning and the actual content of the poems and the questions that they were answering. Their discussion, their responses to each other was another way, and their actual annotations on the poem itself were things that I had collected and looked at during class to determine whether or not students were understanding the content of the poem, the concepts that it really was speaking to, and then the strategies of both annotating and questioning.
Is there a band?
You know what,
The question is, what did you do for students who did not acquire the literary skills addressed in this lesson?
There were, most of the students present demonstrated proficiency in what I was looking for. There were 2 students who were struggling. One, I have scaffolded questions for her, and actually she has an alternative homework assignment for tonight to help just shore up the skills that we worked on today before she moves forward tomorrow, and I'll touch base with her at the beginning of tomorrow's class. The other student has been absent for a series of days, and so one of the things I did in the block earlier when I had seen him was to start to get him caught up, have a conversation with him about where we are. But as far as what I was able to assess in the lesson, I was able to assess what I assessed for the rest of the class 2 days ago. So as far as where he'll be, I'll have to see that tomorrow in class.
Which behaviors from Core Action 3 did the students best exemplify in this lesson? What actions have you taken as the teacher to make that happen?
Can we pause for a second?
Yeah. Okay, so which behaviors from Core Action 3 did the students best exemplify in this lesson? And what actions have you taken as a teacher to make that happen?
I think the students did a really good job at supporting what they had to say with evidence from the text. Whether or not it was their analysis of the questions themselves or their responses to the questions themselves, they did a very good job about going back to the language of the poem to explain why their interpretation was what it was. Where students weren't doing that, I would specifically ask them, where does it say it in the poem that makes you think that? Where does Whitman specifically say that? What makes you think that based on what Whitman wrote? But in general, I thought that they did that very well. As far as independence, I think that they're working on that. Some of them really, within their groups, took the lead as soon as I gave them the task. They set to discussion. At one point I walked over to one group and some girl had mentioned her interpretation of where something was in a question, and as I was on my way over, so it wasn't because I was there, one of the other members of the group said, "Oh, I didn't originally have that, but that makes sense, maybe I should put that," and they continued to talk about it. So that type of independence and furthering their understanding of a concept is, I think, a good sign as far as what they're able to do related to Core Action 3.
Would you like to comment on any of the students' submitted work? Was there something that delighted you or surprised you with this work?
I have one student who habitually struggles, and much of the scaffolding that I provide or that I have in case I need it is for her and one of her classmates specifically. And she, unsolicited, independently, before they even had a group discussion, came up with the fact that the possessive language that Whitman uses is because each of the Americans listed in the poem owns something. And she's like, it's kind of like they have freedom to do what they want. And I was thrilled because the fact that she was able to make that build that conceptual understanding without my prompting or the conversation of her peers shows me that she's really making progress with meeting standards and her reading ability. So that was delightful for me.
Great instructors are continuously learning. We want to understand what you celebrated in this lesson and what you would improve upon. Reflecting on the lesson, what worked particularly well and what might you do differently?
I'm a big fan of color coding. I'm a visual learner. I like to see things. So I think that breaking down the different elements of what an interesting critical question would have, using the different colors to see how those different components contribute to a good discussion questions that students want to create on their own, I thought that worked well. I was able to very clearly see what the students understood and didn't understand quickly. The beginning part, it was definitely review at the beginning, but I just felt like I was talking too much. I wanted to hear from them sooner. So I probably would redesign that beginning review to be more in the students' hands than it was in mine.
Were there any surprises or unexpected student behaviors or reactions?
Not to the work itself. I don't know if we had some leftover snow day energy from yesterday affecting two gentlemen in the corner, but aside from that, for the most part, the way they interacted in groups, if anything was surprising, it was positive. I really liked some of the way students were trying to use what they knew about history to make sense of the poem and answer the questions that they had been given to discuss. Some of the lack of understanding of history and the timeline of history, I don't know that it was surprising. I had a sense of that was their understanding, but I was happy that they used their technology to help them figure out where things fit as far as, different events and rights and what would be common. And I thought the language they used was very appropriate, whereas they could have, when they talked about differences between men and women and what their roles were in society in the 1800s, none of it was too terribly biased or inappropriate, and so that was a good thing.
That's it. You're done.